So, with the release of Chapter 5, it seems like the debate on the Knight's identity has really been shaken up. Carol Knighters have become Death Knighters, Rudy Knighters have become Carol Knighters, and Death Knighters have become, Carol Knighters again. This video was actually sort of brought about by Spooky Dude's Carol Knight video. Not that I'm saying it's a bad video, in fact I would recommend my fellow Death Knighters to give it a watch. It's given me a lot of respect for Carol Knight as a theory, and I think he makes some really good points, even if it didn't convince me fully. It'll be linked in the description. However, my opinion on the Knight's identity has actually not changed with the new chapter. In fact, I think Chapter 5 has left Death Knight stronger than it has ever been before. Before we start, I just want to have a quick disclaimer. I know the Knight's identity has always been sort of a hot topic, but I encourage everyone to be respectful to our fellow theorists, even if you may disagree with them. In fact, I even cover some of the strengths of the opposing theories and some flaws in Death Knight, so this has a little something for everyone. Now, without further ado, let's begin with... So, I'm starting with this as our first subject, because while Chapter 5 doesn't give a ton of evidence supporting Death Knight, I think it has a lot of stuff that goes against the other big two Knight theories, those being Rudy Knight and Carol Knight. So let's start with Rudy Knight. So, I know a lot of people think Rudy Knight isn't a very good theory, and while I agree it isn't very likely, and I haven't been a huge fan of it, I actually think it's quite a bit stronger than most people give it credit for, so I'm actually going to start off by mentioning a positive about it. A detail I feel like many people gloss over when discussing Rudy Knight and the Knight's identity in general is how the Knight looks and acts. When we first see them, the Knight appears to be either crying or drooling and floating in a sort of hunched over position. The Roaring Knight is also known for, well, roaring, and it overall seems to have a lot of sort of animalistic behavior. There's also the fact that the Knight can shapeshift into various forms, and it seems that the Knight isn't really a normal Lightner. I think Rudy's sickness sort of manifesting in the Dark World is actually really compelling and satisfies this aspect of the Knight very well. Now, I should probably start going into the points against this theory before I get too distracted, though the Knight's physical properties are going to come up later. So, I think the main point against Rudy Knight is simply the logistics of it. Even in Chapter 3, I think we get some pretty solid evidence against Rudy being the Knight. By the end of Chapter 3, we know that Undyne was taken into the shelter by the Knight, and I just really don't think Rudy would be capable of doing something like this. The distance between Toriel's house and the shelter is a very long one, and while you could make the argument that Undyne would be caught off guard upon leaving the Dark World, I don't think that initial surprise would last long enough to drag her literally across the entire town. Especially when she's known for being quite strong. I mean, she literally bench presses cars. I could believe someone known to be fast and strong like Carol could pull this off, but I don't think the same guy who struggled to stand around in church could do it. And then of course there's the elephant in the room, Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, Noelle gets a call from Carol saying that Rudy fell down at the festival. Now, I don't believe that means fell down as in a state in which monsters die, as mentioned in Undertale. I'm honestly not even sure if that exists in Deltarune. However, I do think this is a sign that Rudy's health is getting worse. It could explain why the Knight is so late to the Flower Kingdom, though the Knight doesn't seem to have gotten any weaker or really changed much from their last appearance. Which wouldn't make a ton of sense in my opinion, considering that Rudy having fallen down seems to be a pretty major moment in the story, and if he is the Knight, that would reflect in some way. There's also the fact that the Flower King is very far from the shelter, and Rudy would have to somehow carry a guy twice his size all the way there while being a lot sicker than last time. You could make the argument that the weird shadow orb the Knight puts Asgore in, like, teleports him to the shelter. It means Rudy wouldn't have to carry Asgore all the way there, which I actually think makes some sense. But still, I think the main evidence against Rudy Knight from Chapter 5 is it just really doesn't seem like that's where his character is going. I think Rudy's worsening health is going to be a main plot point in Chapter 6, and Rudy being the Knight doesn't really fit in with that all too well. And as much as I don't want Rudy to die, I love Rudy, I don't think we can rule out something like that could happen in Chapter 6, and, well, the Knight dying before the story is even over would be pretty weird. So overall, while I wouldn't rule out Rudy Knight completely, I do think that it's very unlikely considering the practicality of it and the narrative aspect as well. Now, this leads on to the next major Knight theory, Carol Knight. Quick aside, I've seen someone else call this Nightmare, and I like that name a lot, but I'm still going to use Carol Knight because it's the more common one. Now, I've seen a few people turn towards Carol Knight after this chapter, however I think Chapter 5 actually gives us some major evidence against it. Now, I'm going to really quickly introduce you to a little thing called Triple Trucy's theory. This is actually another thing that Spooky Dude made a video about before going back on it for some reason.
How I think Triple Trucy's is kind of pointless at this point.
So if you don't know, Triple Trucy's is a theory that there are sort of three factions at play here instead of simply the Fun Gang and the Knight Squad. There's a third faction, and Chris is sort of a triple agent working for all of them. Now, the exact factions may vary depending on which flavor of the theory you find, however I personally subscribe to the idea that the three factions are the Fun Gang, Carol and Asgore, and the Knight. Now, Chapter 5 actually gives some really strong evidence supporting this idea. The main thing is that Asgore, who Carol is financially supporting and working with, is actually working against the Knight. In the Flower Castle, Asgore talks about how his goal is actually to find the Knight. This pretty clearly works against Carol Knight, because if Carol was the Knight, that would mean she's supporting someone who is actively working against her. Now, there is a counter-argument to this, which I want to address. The main counter-argument is that Carol was actually manipulating Asgore in order to trap him inside the Flower Kingdom Dark World so she could capture him and fulfill the prophecy. Now, I think this is untrue for a few reasons. Number one, Carol has a corkboard of her own and allows Asgore to see it. If this was all a master plan to betray him, this wouldn't really make much sense. Wouldn't you want to keep him in the dark as much as possible? Now, you could say that access to her information was part of the way she enticed Asgore to work for her, but I doubt this as well. When we see him before the festival, Asgore mentions that his work with Carol might get him his old job back. I think this is more than enough motivation, and that Carol wouldn't need to, quote, sweeten the deal to entice Asgore. In fact, sort of a side tangent here, but I think the sheer fact that Carol has a corkboard in the first place sort of works against her being the Knight. I mean, if Carol really was the Knight, she obviously wouldn't have a conspiracy board of information about herself. This could just be info about Jess's disappearance, though I just personally feel this sort of thing speaks more to someone who really doesn't have all the info here. Which, to be fair, not having all the information about what's going on doesn't exclude Carol from being the Knight, but I thought it was still worth mentioning. Now we move on to point number 2 against the idea that Carol betrayed Asgore. So, the main idea behind why Carol would betray Asgore like this is that it's to fulfill the prophecy, since we see in Chapter 4 that Asgore is involved with the prophecy and needs to be, quote, trapped in an asylum. However, in Chapter 3 we see the Knight actually doesn't kidnap who they intended. Despite all the setup the Knight and Chris put into kidnapping Toriel, the Knight actually ends up taking Undyne instead. I feel like this really goes against the previous idea. If the Knight's main motivation is heeding the prophecy at all costs, why are they so willing to just switch to Undyne after failing to get Toriel? Wouldn't that be a pretty huge break from the prophecy? And for this one, I actually have an alternate explanation. I saw an amazing video a little while ago by a channel named Player Carter, in which they put forward the idea that the Knight needs to steal the determination of others in order to make dark fountains. Now, I won't go through the entire theory, just a few of the major points, but it's absolutely worth watching in its entirety, and I have it linked in the description below. So the idea is that the reason the Knight hasn't caused the roaring yet isn't because they're rigidly following the prophecy, but because they simply don't have the ability to do so. We know that making a dark fountain takes determination, something all Lightners possess. However, the Knight can't just keep spamming dark fountains to cause the roaring, because this requires determination. And therefore, the reason the Knight kidnaps people is to siphon their determination. Whether this kills them or not is sort of left up in the air, but I certainly hope not. Now, the main evidence of the theory is that it explains why one of the fountains in the Chapter 4 Church Dark World is inexplicably smaller. I think this could be explained by the Knight either running low on determination or trying to ration it out. So that was a lot of me rambling, but in summary, those are the 2 points that I think go against the idea that Carol manipulated Asgore, and that in fact Carol and Asgore are on a separate team for the Knight. Now, despite all this talking, I'm still not done. You see, Carol is very much associated with ice and cold. The room gets colder when she walks in, and her hands feel like ice when she touches someone. However, when we fight the Knight in Chapter 3, we really don't see this ice motif at all. You might point to these pointed bullets the Knight uses in its first attack and say they're snowflakes, however they're referred to as stars in the files. In fact, the Knight actually has a stronger connection to fire, which would be the opposite of ice and cold. When the Knight chops the battle box in half, it creates a literal flame effect. And yes, I checked in the game files, and this is referred to as a flame. If the Knight really is Carol, it doesn't make much sense for her battle to have this fire motif, when Carol's is very much the opposite. Finally, there's the Knight's behavior. As I mentioned previously, the Knight acts in a sort of animalistic way where it roars and drools/cries. This feels pretty out of character for the otherwise put-together Carol Holiday. There's also the time when the Knight poses as it floats just out of Susie's reach, and when it laughs before making a Titan near the end of Chapter 4. These both seem rather out of character for Carol, who has so far been characterized as cold and stoic. I don't think these are necessarily a smoking gun against Carol, but definitely something to keep in mind. Now, the final thing I want to bring up here before ending the rebuttal section is how the Knight's body works. We know the Knight can shapeshift its body quite a bit. It can transform into this bird-like creature or into a ball. Heck, it even splits its ribcage open. I think this is a relatively large point against Carol Knight that I don't really see brought up a ton. I've seen people dismiss it by saying that Carol has some kind of special armor or shadow ability that lets her act like this in the Dark World. And while I will concede that we don't exactly know what happened to Des, I think the mysterious disappearing character having his weird powers and abilities is a lot more believable than an otherwise normal Lightner having his weird shapeshifting and body morphing powers. I know I had a lot of negative things to say about Carol Knight, but I do want to reiterate that I don't hate the theory. Heck, I don't think I could really bring myself to, quote, hate any theory, even if I disagree with it. I think Carol Knight does have quite a bit going for it, with Carol having the most clear motivations out of any of the possible Knight theories, even if there are a few too many logical holes for it to be true in my opinion. I once again suggest giving Spooky Dude's video on it a watch if you're curious about it. Now, with the arguments against the other big two Knight theories wrapped up, I think it's time to present some evidence of my own that December Holiday is the Roaring Knight. I think a good place to start is the Dark Worlds. In Chapter 4, we learn that the person who creates the Dark World has a significant impact on what a Dark World will look like. When Susie creates the second sanctuary, the world looks completely different with brand new enemies, despite the fact that it's still the same room as the first one. So I believe that by looking into the Dark Worlds the Knight created, we can find some clues as to their identity. In Chapter 2, we have a scene where we walk with Noelle through Cyber City, and she mentions how Des wanted to take her to a place like this. I think Death Knight makes a lot of sense here. If December wanted to take Noelle to a big city similar to Cyber City, it makes sense that would come across in a Dark World. In Chapter 2, we also see that the moon in the Dark World is a baseball, which would also make sense considering Des's connections to baseball. Skipping ahead to Chapter 4, we can see another connection in the form of Gerson. We know that Gerson used to be a teacher. And considering that Des is older than Noelle and Chris, it's likely that when she was around Chris's age, she was taught by Gerson and not Alphys before Gerson eventually passed away. Rousey explains that creating a darkener from the memories of a person who has passed away requires a strong connection to them. We see that when Susie tries to make another dark fountain to meet Gerson, she fails because she never actually met him when he was alive. However, in both of the Knight's Dark Worlds, Gerson is alive, meaning that the Knight has some kind of connection with him. And I don't think there's any evidence pointing towards Rudy or Carol having a connection to Gerson the same way Des would by being a student. Now that we've discussed the Knight's Dark Worlds, let's move on to their appearance and traits. First of all, the Knight has antlers. I think this is pretty blatant proof that the Knight is a member of the Holiday family. Sure, it's not 100% guaranteed, but I really don't see why the Knight would have antlers if they weren't related to the holidays. However, there's another element in the Knight's design that narrows it down even more. At the beginning of the fight with the Knight, they summon their sword. And this sword looks exactly like a baseball bat. This is something very much associated with Des, as shown by the fact that she holds one in Noelle's computer wallpapers in Chapter 4. Sure, it morphs into a more traditional sword right after, but the Knight is known to be able to change its shape. And that still doesn't change the fact that at this moment it very much looks like a baseball bat. And I already kind of went over this before, but I do think Death Knight has a pretty good case for the whole ability to shapeshift thing. I know it's kind of a cop-out to just say, well, Des has mysterious circumstances surrounding her, so maybe she got weird magic shapeshifting shadow powers after her disappearance. At least there is actually some wiggle room as to why she would be able to do these things, whereas many other Knight theories can't really explain this. This is kind of the main reason I have some respect for Rudy Knight. One last thing I wanted to mention was the motif of stars that's quite heavily associated with the Knight. As shown by the Shadow Mantle, the Knight's element is dark/star. Dark makes a lot of sense considering they're all black and are some sort of antagonistic force of pure darkness that's going to bring the roaring. But star seems a little out of place. I mean, the Knight uses stars in their attacks, but that still doesn't explain why. But lo and behold, in Des's room you can see stars on the wall. It's admittedly not a huge connection, but I can't really think of any other characters really associated with stars. And there's also the fact that Des was a musician in a band, so she's also kind of a figurative star, as in like a rock star. This could also explain the fire motif, with real-life stars being giant balls of fire. Now, with physical traits out of the way, let's get into the way the Knight actually behaves. So first up is, once more, the Knight's aforementioned animalistic behavior. This could simply be explained away as a product of whatever the heck turned Des into the Knight in the first place. However, I want to briefly mention some dialogue from the Ribic anime back in Chapter 3. The anime has dialogue talking about a girl, specifically a girl who is, quote, lost. The phrase lost girl is pretty obviously tied to Des, considering it's a song with the same name that often plays in scenes related to her, and the fact that, well, she's a girl who is lost. What more is there to say, really? However, Ribic's dialogue about this lost girl doesn't end there. They also describe her as messy, unfocused, rowdy, and dirty. Which, sure, when I think messy and unfocused, I don't think someone literally ripping their chest open and screaming, but this characterization of Des could relate to her being the Knight. I mean, we can also sort of assume some things about her personality from her room and what other people say about her, but I think this dialogue in particular was still worth mentioning. Speaking of her room, during our fight with the Knight, they even posed in a way that somewhat is similar to ice skating stances, which we know is a sport Des participated due to the skates we find in her room. There is also something I mentioned before, which is how the Knight acts in a sort of taunting way towards the party. They pose in front of Susie and laugh in front of the fun gang, as I've mentioned. Again, we don't know a ton about Dessa's character, but I think these actions make a lot more sense under the lens of a rebellious teen/young adult, as opposed to Rudy or Carol, who would be more mature. Though, to be fair, I think there could be a case for Rudy acting this way, but I really don't think this fits for Carol. However, when we're talking about the behavior of the Knight, this leads us on to... Now, I'm a Death Knighter through and through. However, I think we have to admit this theory is far from perfect. I think the biggest flaw in the theory is the motivations of the Knight and how they tie into Death. From what little we know about the Knight, they seem to be this sort of unfeeling authoritarian figure who acts as an arbiter of fate, carrying out the prophecy. This really doesn't match up with Dessa's character that has been established. Sure, she could be a tad forceful at times, hitting Chris with a wiffle ball bat, but Dess has always been painted as a very rebellious figure, and if anything, she would be fighting against fate, not enforcing it. This sort of role would be much better suited to someone like Carol. However, I do have an argument. A different take that I think could work in favor of Death Knight. I believe that the Knight is not necessarily enforcing the prophecy. You see, my point is that the prophecy seems to detail the events of Deltarune's story, and that acting in accordance with it is less the character looking at the prophecy and following it, but the prophecy following that character's future actions. For example, the prophecy says that Lancer will say toothpaste and then boy. He does exactly this, but obviously this doesn't make Lancer some sort of warrior of fate just by following the prophecy's actions. As mentioned before, I think the reason the Knight hasn't started the roaring isn't because it's trying to follow the events of the prophecy, but because the events of the prophecy are following it. The Knight needs to extract the determination from other monsters to cause the roaring in the first place, so despite the fact that they want to cause it, they can't. Not yet. In summary, my idea is that the Knight is not acting in service to the prophecy, but to their own agenda. Now, even with this being said, there are still some holes in even this interpretation. And that is of course the question of why would Death want to cause the roaring? It seems like it would cause untold destruction, and overall be a very bad thing. And my answer to that is, I don't actually know. That's sort of the problem with making theories about an unfinished game, is that we don't quite have all the pieces yet. We don't really have a super clear grasp of the Knight's plan. Though to be fair, I feel like this sort of thing is a point against the other two Knight theories as well. Why would Rudy want to cause the roaring? We don't know. Why would Carol want it? Makes even less sense. Her whole character is about preserving things as they are, and the roaring basically destroying the world is kind of the antithesis to that. So, with that, this brings us to the end of my Death Knight video. I sort of made this after seeing a lot of the Knight videos after Chapter 5, not really talking about how some of the new information weakens Carol and Rudy Knight from the perspective of a Death Knighter. There of course have been videos discussing evidence against Carol Knight and against Rudy Knight, but not really anything from the lens of a more long-time Death Knighter perspective, and I thought I might as well toss my hat into the ring here. Again, I actually think Rudy Knight and especially Carol Knight aren't bad theories by any means. They have a lot of strength, as I mentioned before, even though I do still think Death is the most likely of the Knight candidates. The music I use as well as the videos I mentioned before will be in the description. This is, I guess, technically the second sort of theory video I've made on a Deltarune thing if you count the Noel test one. Though I think this theory is kind of the first one where I'm really arguing a certain point, as the other one was more just kind of analyzing what was happening in the various installments. So yeah, this is going to be the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts on it, feel free to leave them down in the comments. I very much enjoy reading them. Have a nice day.